Moral panics in contemporary society. In this presentation, I'll be discussing how McRobbie and Thornton is right in suggesting that changes in the structure and nature of society in late modernity make the concept of a moral panic redundant. So what is a moral panic? The sociologist Stanley Cohen first discussed the concept of moral panics in his 1972 book, Folk Devils and Moral Panics. Cohen argued how moral panics involved a person, a group of people, or condition which is portrayed by the media as a risk to society morals and values. Often it is portrayed in a stereotypical manner, and the moral standard is typically set by right-thinking people such as church leaders and politicians. Experts regularly diagnose the moral panic and offer a solution. However, the moral panic can either be forgotten quickly or become more prominent with changes to the law. Moral panics can either be a new or old issue which suddenly receives attention in the media. Cohen argued that the emerging youth culture mods and rockers were folk devils, and how modern rockers created a moral panic with reactionary media reporting of their antics in several seaside towns in the 1960s. McRobbie and Thornton, in the British Journal of Sociology, argued that changes in the structure and nature of society in late modernity made the concept of a moral panic redundant and out of date. The previous folk devils were no longer marginalised because of the large expansion of media. Now there's more niche and micro media which supports alternative social groups. McRobbie and Thornton discussed how society was no longer monolithic and traditional, and that people in today's society there was more individuality in society, and said how being deviant, culturally radical and transgressive was just part of youth culture. In the Crime and Media book, Moore discussed how the internet has changed moral panics. The way people consume media has changed over the last decade, with people more likely to use the internet instead of newspapers and television news broadcasts for their news. There are various news websites which makes it harder for the media to influence the public and set their own agenda. And minority viewpoints can be expressed more easily over the internet, with more blogs, niche news websites, and numerous television channels providing people with alternative news sources. This would suggest that moral panics are less relevant. It can also be argued that societal changes have made moral panics redundant. Society is less worried about deviant social groups, and that contemporary moral panics tend not to have a moral undertone. It can also be argued that the decline in conservative values have changed the nature of moral panics. Society is no longer alarmist about nonconformist social groups. People are now more socially liberal and more tolerant towards minority groups. On the other hand, it can be said that moral panics are just part of moral relegation, and that both moral panics and moral relegation form our understanding about what is right and wrong in society. The Marxism perspective by Hall says moral panics are just simply created by the ruling classes. Hall said how moral panics are used to create fear among the general population, with the intention to divert the public's attention away from the elite's power. Hall discussed how the ruling classes takes advantage of the public's fear of crime by concentrating on minor crimes committed by particular groups. Hall said how moral panics were used by the elite ruling classes to maintain their own law and order policies. However, in the Journal of Youth Studies, Griffiths discussed how moral panics are actually still relevant in contemporary society. Griffiths discussed how the media portrayal of goths following the Columbine shooting demonstrated that moral panics were still relevant. It was shown how, in the media, the goths were portrayed as the new folk devils. There was many negative articles and alarmist headlines published about the Gothic subculture. Even this moral panic had a societal impact, with the banning of several Gothic-related symbols in high schools in several American states. However, it can be argued how the changes to moral panics have changed. No, late modernity societies changed moral panics. Modern rockers and goths were both moral panics, however, the two subcultures were portrayed very differently in the media. Small niche goth websites defended their subculture, and many goths offered to take part in interviews with leading newspapers and television news broadcasters, discussing how the media misrepresented their subculture. It can also be said how homosexuals who were previously part of the moral panic of HIV and AIDS adopted a tactic to challenge their media image. Gay men and women used the media to tell their side of the story in late modernity society. The conflation theory can also dispute McRobbie and Thornton's argument that moral panics are redundant. The conflation theory says how people's realities and views are affected by television exposure, since television transmits images and ideological messages. It can be said in today's society this still remains relevant, as television usage still remains high. According to Ofcom, 97% of households have a TV, whilst people on average watch 3 hours and 42 minutes worth of television a day. This would suggest that the conflation theory is still relevant in today's society, and accordingly moral panics remain relevant in late modernity society. However, the reception theory can demonstrate that moral panics are redundant. The reception theory says that people examine the media differently because of their own individual cultural and life experiences. A group of people consuming media are expected to understand the media in the same manner if they all share the same cultural experiences. As there is more individuality in society, with more varied cultural backgrounds, it can be argued that the reception theory is more applicable in today's society. Accordingly, moral panics are less relevant. In conclusion, it can be argued that McRobbie and Thornton is right. Moral panics are now redundant. The internet and the rise in alternative media has changed the way we consume media. Society is now more socially liberal and tolerant towards minority social groups. There's more individuality in society, and society is generally more culturally different. And society is less likely to be collectively shocked by moral panics. However, the conflation theory would suggest that society is still influenced by the media. The panic over goths demonstrate how there are still contemporary moral panics. Nevertheless, the way contemporary moral panics are portrayed has changed. For example, goths used their own micro-media and the media to defend their subculture. Folk devils now have their own media and can challenge the media bias against them.